Hello everyone, your favorite night owl here, out on this unfortunately sunny day. So, you want to start a militia, do you? Well, let's talk about that. But before we get started, like, share, and subscribe. Check out the link below to my Subscribestar account, which is another DSR of a Rule of Impact. Help a small creator out. This will be uploaded to my BitChute account, which is also under DSR of a Rule of Impact, as well as my YouTube account, which is just DSR. Fantastic! This is a part of my Militia 101 series, which will be shot in various formats. Alrighty then, let's get on with it, shall we? As to today's question, out and about on my favorite walking path. So, you want to start a militia, do you? Well, there's a series of questions that need to be followed then before you even really get started, of which we shall go through, which includes the social ramifications, followed by organizational questions, and stated goals. What is the purpose of your militia? Well, obviously, since it's militia, it's in defense of something. The question is what? And then there's the fact that when you do get started, moving down the path, you have to take into account the social ramifications, which includes, and not limited to, public perception, which can swing either varying degrees positive, negative, or flat out neutral. However, there's also other considerations which can further add that. See, this comes down to their perception of the idea of a militia, potentially what the militia you plan to start is named, and then there's other factors such as their perception of you personally. There's also whatever your stated goal happens to be of said militia. Then we move on to that, which must be taken into account rather significantly because it can limit you in many ways, unless you want to be a hypocrite. There is the fact that you can start your militia as sort of a civic guard, in which your just goal is general protection of the community, regardless of who's trying to cause harm to the community, or an ideological-based militia where you're trying to defend a Pacific world point of view. This can, of course, be religious or political. Generally speaking, people tend to, in my own experience, when you mention a militia group, they tend to ask what the politics of that group. Are they right-wing, left-wing? And that can greatly affect their position on it. Also, there tends to be a general negative perception of religious-based organizations when it comes to a militia. Civic Guard can vary greatly and does come into account one's own personal views and how the community at large views them. For example, you may be quite well intentioned in starting your civil guard, but if there is a sizable number of people in the community who don't particularly like you for one reason or another, they may imply those negative feelings directly onto the militia that you intend to start. This is something to be greatly concerned about because perception is everything. There is another route to take, but this can worsen problems, although some people might be more understanding than others, and the problem in question is how they are perceived if you try to keep your starting a militia a secret. That could avoid some of the public perception issues until it is inevitably discovered, which will inevitably, at least in my own opinion, cause a degree of negative feelings towards it, as then they'll question why you are trying to keep it a secret, even if you were well-intentioned in doing so. Perception is king. Alrighty then. Moving on. Once you've decided what your particular goal is, and have come to terms with public perception, as it is a civil guard, tend to be a little bit easier to answer the next questions. Although a religious or, well, general ideological, whether it be religious or political militia group, tends to have a little bit difficult in the next question. Recruitment. How you intend to recruit. I do have future videos just on that. If it's ideological based, that does limit your recruitment pools, essentially, to people of that particular ideology. And even then, there can be different interpretations of that ideology, which can cause division anyway, potentially further restricting who you can recruit. And then there's other matters to take into account in terms of recruitment, which is quite unfortunate. In a civil guard, you tend to be able to recruit a lot more. However, then you have to get into a question of what standards are you going to set for joining? Are you going to provide equipment, or are they going to provide their own? And are you going to set limitations on what that equipment can be? Certain standards, which can further restrict who you're going to recruit. This is a matter that needs to be taken into account relatively early on. Doesn't matter what your intentions are if the number of people you can potentially recruit is fairly small, which would then highly restrict the size of your group. And that's another matter to take into account. Size. How large do you desire your little group to be? Do you want it to eventually grow into something particularly larger, or stay relatively small, like a close-knit community? Personally speaking, I'm very for the idea of a civic guard, essentially trained in armed citizenry, being organized to provide local protection for those who live locally. Fantastic. Moving on. There are other considerations which must be taken into account, which will be brought up in future videos. There's also supplies which you must take into account as well, because depending on your group and what other people perceive of it, it can make it difficult to get supplies for it. There's also different kinds of supplies. One of the biggest ones that can be difficult at times is water, depending on where you live. However, that is getting off topic and for another video. How unfortunate. There is a matter to take into account, is if one is particularly well supplied and growing, that can alter people's perceptions. People who might have been more open to your group beforehand when it was small, if you go, say, from 10 people to 100 and then to 1,000, people who are neutral might swing into the negative, because it might create the perception that you're trying to build yourself a little army. That might actually be your goal. You don't know. I don't particularly know, just for sure. It comes down to your individual group and your intended goals. It's up to you. Fantastic. Of course, moving on from supplies, we've covered public perception, which can influence one's supply. There's also organization. How is it to be organized, which can greatly affect your perspective on it. There will be a future video on that topic. Now, organizing can also restrict who can be recruited anyway, because however you organize, some people might be incompatible with that particular organizational style, and that can restrict who you can use. And on top of that, organization can also restrict how one responds to problems for your particular armed group. This is due to the fact that if your organization is not very flexible, if a problem comes up that your organization is not well suited towards, it can lead to a bit of an issue, in regards that you just simply will not be able to respond effectively. If you're too flexible, though, it can actually lead to issues of your group breaking apart, because it encourages, at least in my own opinion, specializations, and the various groups that may form within may decide they know better, and that their way is the best way, a common human trait, which can be quite, actually flat out tends to be a very unfortunate thing for the rest of the society. However, before I ramble on a little bit too long, we have to wrap this on up. You have to take into account supplies, public perception, your organization. Oh, almost forgot how to equip oneself, which can go back into supplies. And on top of that, depending on where you live, your equipment can be quite restricted, particularly in form of armaments. Although a civil guard doesn't necessarily need to be armed with anything other than non-lethal tools, because their goal is just protecting the community, and how that community wants to be protected can vary. Organizational matters set aside, and then there's supplies, equipment, public perception, which ties into everything, organization, and stated goals. Also, if you're going to try to keep your group a secret, or just keep most of its activities secret, even if the group itself is not. Alrighty then, think about sort of like the Freemasons. Fantastic. Alrighty then, that should wrap it on up. I'd like to thank everyone who sat through the video. Like, share, and subscribe. This is part of a larger series, Militia 101. This will be uploaded to my BitChute account, which is under DSR Rule and Pack. Check out a link below to my Subscribe Star account, which is also under DSR Rule and Pack. Help a small creator out with a small monthly donation. Fantastic! Guess I'll be seeing everyone around.